Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today. My name is Dmitry Vinnik and I'm a developer advocate on the Meta open source team. Today I'll be talking about open source, or as I call it here, the 10,000 steps of open source health. I'll be talking about anything that goes into building a high quality project. So let's get started. Alright, thanks again for joining me today. And as I mentioned, we'll be talking about open source project health. And I always like to establish goals for any talks I give. So first and foremost, we'll define gaps in the open source health so we can actually focus on those. Then we'll discuss guidelines when it comes to open source, because I do not believe in dogmas. I do not believe in a very prescriptive approach to anything, especially open source. So I'll only be giving some guidelines on how to approach those gaps that we'll cover today. And ultimately, throughout today's presentation, the most important thing I'll try to focus on is the fact that communication is the key on all steps of building high quality, very welcoming open source projects. But as I mentioned, I'm a developer advocate on the Meta open source team, where we have plenty of projects we're working with. You can go to our website, opensource.fb.com, where you can read more about the work we do, about our content, about our projects. But more importantly, that I want to focus today is on open source in general. So it's not specific to Meta. And when it comes to open source health, the good question to ask, is there actually metrics that can define the quality of your project? And I'm a strong believer that the short answer to that is no. The long answer, it depends. There is some metrics that exists out there. It can be numbers in the repository, number of stars, watchers, Reddit, Stack Overflow, and other Q&A forums where you can track the discussions, the rate of answering the questions that come up. Twitter and YouTube, those channels where you post your content, you can try to figure out if the overall discussion is positive, or maybe people are finding some valid criticism of your projects. And there's also something called Orbit model that's a startup that focuses on trying to actually quantify and build better communities out there. So I invite you to check it out as well. But honestly speaking, rather than focusing on numbers, what I'll try to take here in this presentation is the more conceptual approach. And that's why I mentioned I'll be focusing on guidelines rather than giving you prescriptive phrase saying, hit 1,000 views on YouTube for your project and you're golden. That's not really the key. The key is the set of guidelines that I'll be describing today. And as I mentioned before, I'm not really focusing on Meta specifically. I'm building on top of the experience I've gotten by working with the projects at Meta and outside of the company. But more importantly, I believe a lot of the things I'll mention, they're still applicable to most projects. That being said, I still take into the account a larger scale projects, beyond a single person. Maybe it's a team of 12, maybe it's more, doesn't really matter, but still, I'm thinking with the scale in mind. So in general, when it comes to open source, what I believe there are 5 types of work that you can focus on when it comes to improving open source health. And again, those types of work towards improving the open source are planning, branding, documentation, and code-based work. And I like that I really specify the code base to be the last. I mean, you can notice that I mentioned 5. It's actually the last of 4, and I'll talk about the 5th later. And while I'm actually giving a presentation, you can start thinking about what the 5th might be. The planning, and that's where again everything starts, is to start asking a question to yourself or the team that you support. Why do you work on open source? Why do you focus on open source to begin with? Open sourcing for the sake of open sourcing is not the goal. It's not the reasoning to go by, because ultimately you have to have a plan. You have to have goal in mind. Potential goals you can think of are recruiting. Maybe you're trying to grow your company, your team, and open source is one of the ways to increase internal morale, but also convince people externally to join you. It can be contributions. You're actually looking for improving your projects. Maybe the community can build additional SDK for Ruby or PHP while you primarily focusing on Java. That's also one of the goals. Maybe another goal is actually branding. Outside of recruiting or even contributions, you try to brand your company as an open source leader and work towards that leadership and credibility in the open source community. But also it might be simply adoption, growing number of users, while not really looking for contributions per se, but just to get your name out there and the name of your project. But more importantly than anything else, it's really thinking long term. It's always exciting to think about how it all begins, that we're going to make it open source, but keep in mind that it's a life cycle. Ultimately, the project, you might need to sunset it, archive. Maybe you're going to move it to a foundation. Maybe you're going to keep growing it exponentially year after year, but you have to think about the long-term plans. So that's very important to establish. But more importantly is really because it's your team that's working on the open source, make sure people are passionate about it. Make sure they're interested, because that's one of the main reasons to do open source. People are actually passionate. They would like to do that to begin with. Another type of open source work is branding. And branding is not just about marketing. Marketing sometimes has not the best understanding in the world. In reality, marketing can actually be a good thing. When it comes to branding towards open source, it really shows your commitment. Things like having a proper name that you researched, you checked the search engine optimization. If you're using some generic word, a generic name that might have been used by some company already, you're probably not going to pop up on the Google search as much as you'd like. Logo, even if you draw it yourself, or maybe with the help of your community, it shows that you cared about it enough, or you committed to it and you're thinking about the long-term growth. Narrative, meaning you don't just create content here and there, some tutorials, some YouTube videos, some blogs. You actually have a narrative in mind of what's your primary audience is and why you're targeting them and how you're targeting them. And the social media, things like Twitter accounts, Facebook pages, all those like names in particular, or even package names, really matters. Wherever your community is, you have to know, because that's the space you're interacting in, and that's the channels you have to create for your project. Another type of open source work you have to keep in mind is documentation. Documentation is one of the cornerstones of open source. It's make it or break it of the project, really. I believe there was some analysis out there that showed that majority of largest, the most popular projects at least have a website with documentation, not only a README or some markdown files here and there, actually searchable, accessible website where you can find documentation, contribute to, and read more about the project. And as I said, again, it's great for contributions. People sometimes only think of how do I start contributing? Code is too complex, but actually making a PR to a doc can be a great start. Also, you need to make sure that your documentation is searchable. The reality is majority of times people go to documentation is maybe it's a quick start, basically get them started, but also more importantly, people go to doc sites to find answer to a particular problem they face. And that's why it's important to make your documentation searchable. That's where websites and tools like Docusaurus or Gatsby really help, because they can quickly create a website, statically generated website for your docs, markdown driven docs, and it's very accessible, it's searchable, people can localize them in different languages. It's a very good tool to build websites. And so it also makes it searchable, as I said. You can also run it by some linters, like Alex.js is a great linter, because it basically finds offensive words that are not making your documentation accessible to the rest of the community. Because one of the things we're trying to achieve is building welcoming community, and projects like Alex.js really help with that. And code base is another type of open source work. And of course, I couldn't just pass by the code itself. You have to have a code of conduct in your repository, because as I mentioned before, one of the most important things is building welcoming community where people feel comfortable interacting. They know they're not going to be harassed. They know they can be open about themselves, but at the same time, very respectful. README, again, it's where everything starts, where people actually read about the projects, apart from the website. A contributor's guide is another important thing you have to make sure your code base has, so people know where to start. Ideally, your project may be so advanced, and I hope more and more projects have that, is a label, good issue, or sometimes I like to see it in projects as well, where contributors or maintainers, they basically have issues that they mark themselves that available for mentorship. So people, beginners in the open source, they can attempt to fix a bug or make a small PR with mentorship and support, close support of those contributors. And again, that's where Contributors Guide can be a good start for people who'd like to become a bigger part of your projects. And that's what really defines a good, healthy open source project. And when it comes to PRs or issues, for example, if you're using GitHub as one of your platforms, for that, you can have templates. So you don't have to go back and forth with the person who filed the bug on you. What's the repro steps? What's the actual result? What did you expect? Instead of just assuming the person knows, and that's important not to have any assumptions really, you define a template. So when person creates a PR, a pull request, they know exactly what you're looking for. When they file an issue or bug, they know exactly what you're looking for. And that's why it's important to define in your code base wherever it resides, GitHub or GitLab or elsewhere. So I mentioned those four, but the last one that I want to mention, and I wonder if anyone actually pinpointed that by now, it's community work. It's really team-driven, especially my role as a developer advocate. I don't just come in to the open source team and say, I'm going to advocate for you. The reality is, the more important is when you try to have members of your community advocate for you. Your goal is really empower the team behind the project, the community behind the project, produce the content on its own. So you can provide as much support as you can as a developer advocate in my case, or just a member of that community to create content, to create blogs, to create videos, to just make Twitter threads, whatever it is. That's the community work that's team-driven, and that's essential. Focus on content. The more content you have, the more searchable your project might be, but also the easier it is to get started. The majority of content I like to see is kind of a basic 101 content. Advanced content is also great, but getting started, having a very good templates, ELI5, like a project we have at Meta Open Source, where we explain very complex projects in just under 3 minutes, under 2 minutes sometimes, in the terms we believe 5-year-olds would understand. That's really the key there. Community space. Create a place for your community to interact with one another. It can be, it can be Slack, it can be Twitter, it can be Discord, wherever else you like. Just create that space where people have a place to discuss your project. But more importantly, you still have to make sure people follow code of conduct there. So again, they are feeling welcomed. But again, the key is communication. Over-communicate other than, don't say what's happening. That's why it's important to talk to your team, to talk to your project contributors and users. So if you're not looking, for example, for contributions, it's totally fine as long as you make it clear to your community. Make that clear, maybe in the README, maybe in your communication channels. But always, thrive for more communication with your project. So I know it's quite a short presentation here, but my call to action for everybody is focus on communication. It really will lead to better project health, better project quality. Know your community, know where they are, what space, what channels they use, Twitter, Facebook. Some people use email for the majority of their communication. Know about that and know where you can interact with those people. But even though I mentioned there is no concrete metrics you can pinpoint, still try to collect it and see, maybe you'll see patterns, maybe you'll see some changes and spikes in sentiment analysis of Twitter mentions of your projects versus alternative project, your competitor. Really it helps to just collect that metrics as well and see on a case by case basis if there is actually a benefit to you. But with that, really, I'd like to thank you all for joining me today. My name is Dmitry Vinnik. You can find me on Twitter, go to my blog, LinkedIn, or email me directly if you have any questions. Thank you so much for your time.